This is just another wrestling podcast featuring Scott Sudakov and Daryl Hatfield. Just another wrestling podcast.
Boring, right? So boring. Fucking sucks.
Hey, it's a working title. Just another wrestling podcast. And now, here are your hosts, Scott Sudakov and Daryl Hatfield.
Hello, everybody. Welcome into a special edition of Just Another Wrestling Podcast. I am your host, Scott Sudakov. No Daryl Hatfield here today. This is a special episode where we have a very special guest on the other line here, being joined today by former WWE NXT announcer, currently a sports play-by-play announcer for various sports and networks, but most recently CBS Sports Network, where he was calling some college basketball into March. Please welcome the first Just Another guest to Just Another Wrestling Podcast, Mr. Alex Del Barrio. Alex, how does it feel to be the first Just Another guest here today?
Scott, I'm so honored to be the first ever Just Another guest. So wouldn't I just be the guest and then whoever comes after me be just another guest?
That's a very good point. I always knew you were a smart man, and that is a good point. So you are just the first guest. Our next guest will be just another guest.
Yes, but no, man. We've been trying to do a project together for a while, and this is fun. While we have the chance to just kind of hang out and just be with our thoughts and be with our own content that we have to produce, since there's nothing else really to do right now in this terrible situation we're in. We're trying to make the best of it. So glad we're getting together and having this chat.
For sure. I've been looking forward to doing this for a while here. And, well, yeah, as you said, we have some extra free time as of late, with both of our normal careers being a bit on hold here with the stop of the sports business. Now, people listening might not. They go, who's Alex Del Barrio? I don't remember Alex Del Barrio on WWE or NXT. Well, that's because your name on television was Alex Reyes. And now my question is, how did that name come about? Did they submit a list of names to you and you chose? Did you submit a list of names to them and they chose? How does this process go? Because I know a lot of different announcers. A guy like Michael Cole. Cole isn't his last name. People might not know that. His last name, I believe, is Coulthard.
And Michael's not even his first name.
There you go.
His middle name is Sean Coulthard. Is that Sean Michael Coulthard, or is I think his full name?
It's kind of like Michael Sean Hickenbottom.
Right, exactly. But yeah, it's an interesting story, and I think it's different for everyone that comes through there, whether you're a wrestling talent or an announcer. I think it's different for everyone. Like, some people get to keep their names, like Kathy Kelly, who had a little bit more of a name to her when she came into the company. She got to keep her name, and I think they just loved the way it kind of rolled off the tongue a little bit. So some people get to keep it just fine. But guys like Josh Matthews isn't his real name. Like Rich Brennan was not Rich Brennan. His name is Rich Bocchini. Tom Phillips is Tom Hannafan. So like everyone's got, usually a different last name. Usually they keep the first name. Mike Rome is actually his name is Austin Romero, so his is like both the first and last name change. But anyways, for me, it kind of happened through the contractual process. I think they just want to get you in line for that to happen, because your name has to go through legal, and like I said, it gets trademarked in some way. I don't really remember them ever going through that process. I just think they want to be ready to trademark it in case they need to. I never really understood the need to change our names, but to each his own. So anyways, they what they do is they send you, they say, Cole, as we're going through the process, is, hey, start thinking about 10 to 12 different names that you can use. That you wouldn't mind having be your work last name. I said you can keep the name Alex, obviously, but just go through that process, take a couple of days, and then send them over to me. So I did, and they came up with a bunch of names. I think one of them was Bravo, because I have a cousin who was a DJ here locally whose last name was Bravo on the air. I think I had my grandmother's maiden name, Garza, on there. I had a lot of Del ones, like Della Garza. I think I had Del Bravo in there as well. I have the list somewhere. I don't know what I've done with it. I haven't looked at it in a while. But
sorry to interject here, but at no point did they ever come to you and say, "Hey, do you want to pretend to be Alberto Del Rio's younger brother?"
No, and it was funny because when I was going through the process of being signed, there's another Ricardo Rodriguez had just been. I think he'd been working with Rob Van Dam at the time on the main roster, and I think Del Rio was coming back. And right, yeah. I remember putting up on Facebook or Twitter, like shortly after I had announced that I had signed, is like, despite what anyone thinks, I am not going to be, Alberto Del Rio's personal ring announcer. But I mean that would have been cool. It would have been fun. But I doubt that they were looking for the guy that they had just signed to NXT to go up to the main roster like that. So anyways, we're going through the process. I sent a bunch of names, and then I didn't hear anything back for a while. And then I think I'm in Florida for. I haven't been signed yet. Like, I'm not working yet, but I had been going to Florida a couple of times for NXT tapings because they wanted me to get the lay of the land, and they wanted me to look for apartments and things like that. And I think I was there for the NXT Takeover Respect, which is the Iron Woman match with Bayley and Sasha.
Okay, yeah.
I think I was backstage for that one, and I got an email from Cole that was CC'd a bunch of people that needed to know, guys like Hunter and Canyon Seaman and a bunch of other folks in the company, and said, I want to introduce our new announcer. His name is Alex Del Barrio, but from then on, his WWE name will be Alex Reyes. And Reyes was not on my list. And I ended up going to Cole. And at this point, you're not trying to rock the apple cart, right? You kind of get what you get, and that's what it is. So I just got to ask Cole, like, hey, Cole, like, this wasn't on my list. Is there a particular reason this one got chosen? And he's like, Hunter picked it. So I was like, well, all right. Well, yeah, if the big boss says that's what your name's going to be, then that's what your name's going to be, I guess. And it was funny because there was actually there's a minor league pitcher. I think he's on the big leagues now with the Cardinals. His name is Alex Reyes. And that actually had come up in the discussion. And Hunter, I guess, said to Cole, don't worry about it. It's not like we're going to make T-shirts for the guy. So
your dreams were crushed right there.
So my dreams of ever having an Alex Reyes T-shirt at the merge stand ended right there. But yeah, that's the story. Pretty straightforward. You submit a bunch of names, and maybe it gets picked, maybe it doesn't. Some guys get a longer process to come up with the name. I was not allowed that much of a process.
I have a couple of questions coming out of that story there. First one is you've been referring to Michael Cole as Cole. Is that something that people just do? They just say, "Hey, Cole."
Oh yeah, yeah. It's pretty much how it's a lot of last name basis around there. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not like he'll stop you off at when you try to say Mr. Cole. I think I tried to do Mr. Cole like once. I think in an email, it's like, don't ever call me Mr. Cole again.
Because it's not even his name. It's not his name anyway, so it's weird, right?
Well, his email address is still like, I'm not going to give you your email address out loud, but it's like it's in the how like you can put what your name is. How it appears. Well, it's Michael Cole. So, I mean, that's how he goes in the company. Everyone in the company knows him as Michael Cole. Very few people know him as Sean Coulthard. But yeah, we all kind of refer to him as Cole. It's funny, different guys get different names.
You kind of you stole some thunder from one of my next questions. They say, how much money to get Triple H's WWE corporate email?
A lot. We'd have to talk about it off air, but definitely not on the air. But I actually think Hunter has separate emails.
Wow, smart.
Yeah, because he's one of those guys that's so high up in the company that they have. I think he has two personal assistants probably that take care of a lot of his business stuff, and I think he's got another one that like he'll use a different one for intercompany contacts, and he operates through text message a lot. So. But yeah, you don't expect to get a email address for Triple H on this podcast. Nice try.
He probably just he probably has Triple H at AOL.com. He came up around, that time AOL emails were big. He probably still has it.
You'd be surprised how many. Well, you probably not, because you've probably been around a lot of older broadcasters that still stick on to their AOL accounts. It's no different like that in the company when you start to see, like, when the scripts go out and everyone gets that first draft of the scripts and how many AOL accounts and Yahoo accounts are on the thread. Yeah, it's pretty funny sometimes.
I want to backtrack a little bit now with you. I believe you grew up in Texas, right?
I did, yeah. Mission, Texas, home of Tom Landry.
Grew up in Texas,
and Tito Santana. Tito Santana, Tom Landry, same high school.
Nice. And so, what are your earliest memories of wrestling? When did you become a fan? When did it? Everyone sort of has that initial story. What was it for you?
So I've talked about this a few times. Actually, Byron Saxon actually used to write stuff for .com. And we talked about, when did I become a wrestling fan? And I can actually pinpoint the moment when I became a wrestling fan. It was actually, and I got into it a little bit later than most folks. I think I might have been, I guess it would have been 10 years old. But it was the episode of Monday Night Raw when 1-2-3 Kid beat Razor Ramon in the first time. It was their first ever match. And it was one of those moments where Vince was saying, anything can happen on Monday Night Raw and anything can happen on the World Wrestling Federation. And it was one of those moments that just kind of stood out in my mind, that this kind of wow, this is actually exciting and things are so spontaneous, and look at the atmosphere. And that's really my first real memory of wrestling. And I know I had seen it before. I knew who Hulk Hogan was and Sergeant Slaughter and some of those guys, but I was never into it. I never watched it. I didn't watch a lot of stuff before that age that wasn't cartoons. So when I started to click over on Monday nights to Monday Night Raw, I was like, oh, what is this? And I see Razor Ramon lose to 1-2-3 Kid, and he's going ballistic, and the crowd's going wild, and that was the exact moment. And then I was hooked ever since. I would go to the video stores and I would rent everything wrestling, any old WWF tapes that I could find, SummerSlams and Royal Rumbles and WrestleManias. I would try to watch them as much in order as possible, so I knew the storylines. And I educated myself on the history of not only WWF but WCW as well. Because I would even watch WCW Saturday Night. In fact, my grandma and I used to watch it like that. I used to stay with my grandma a lot of times on Saturdays, and we kind of had a deal where I could watch WCW Saturday Night, which came on at 5:05 on the Central Time Zone.
Right.
And it was 2 hours. And then after it was over, I would sit there and watch, Sábado Gigante with her. And, and that was our deal. She would watch wrestling with me and I would watch, Don Francisco with her. So that's how those are some of my early, watching wrestling memories.
Now, you didn't grow up, in the 80s in Texas more so. You grew up more in the 90s, but did you ever, come across the whole world-class Von Erichs kind of dynasty? Did it ever engulf you?
No, it was never something that was on my radar. Just because, like I said, I didn't get into it until the mid-90s, the early to mid-90s with, when it was kind of the new generation era. So it was everything after WrestleMania 9. The first pay-per-view, I remember the stories leading up to it, where it was that first King of the Ring pay-per-view from Dayton. So everything else I kind of learned, going backwards. And in fact, my first exposure to Kerry Von Erich was as the Texas Tornado. So
right.
When I started to learn more about the business and realize, oh man, Kerry Von Erich was a big deal, and in all over the state of Texas, but all over the Southwest. So it's interesting how big Texas wrestling was to a lot of people, and I didn't get exposed to that until much later in my wrestling history journey as someone who was just a super fan.
When did you start to become interested in being a broadcaster? And when that happened, was it because you wanted to be a wrestling announcer, or were you thinking about what you do now, obviously, and what you've done even before you were with WWE, doing play-by-play and doing sports anchoring and reporting for quote-unquote traditional sports? Kind of what was the genesis of that?
Well, it's interesting. I always thought I always thought doing the wrestling announcing thing would be cool, but it's like you're one of those childhood things that you think, oh, I want to be an astronaut, oh, I want to be a fireman, type of things, oh, I want to be Howard Finkel. I think I remember like Todd Pettengill having some sort of contest where they were trying to find a co-host for that show, WWF Mania, and I think I did an audition for that, but it was never something like, oh, I want to do this for a career. That didn't happen until like high school. When I started to like really get into the NBA. I think my journey as a sports announcer kind of started with wanting to be a basketball announcer.
Same.
I think both in the terms of like Ray Clay with the Chicago Bulls like introductions. It was right around the time where like NBA was really starting to kick up. Starting lineup introductions after what the Bulls were doing. I
have to say, I just got goosebumps when you said his name and mentioned it because, the same for me in that, mid to late 90s period is they always would show those intros before big Bulls games on NBC or whatever it might be. And you just, oh, man, great. Oof, just getting chills thinking about it.
Yeah, and it was one of those, like, I was probably the only person outside of Chicago that knew Ray Clay's name. Like, it was like, who knows the PA announcer for NBA teams games, like living in South Texas, but I did because I was a big fan of his. And then Marv Albert was my play-by-play, guy, the guy that I wanted to emulate, or the guy that was kind of the voice of my childhood, at least in terms of basketball. So those are the two kind of influences I had. And then I would watch wrestling and sports kind of at the same time. And, you thought, well, at the time you're thinking, oh, it's the same business. You're going to be a sports announcer, being a wrestling announcer is the same as being a basketball announcer. And it really doesn't work that way. It does in some ways. And in some ways it obviously doesn't. It's a very different career path, and it's a very different job. Doing TV for sports is similar in a lot of ways, but very different in a lot of ways to doing it for pro wrestling. So, but yeah, that's kind of the genesis of where my sports announcing like desires came from. It kind of came a little bit later when I started getting into shoot sports.
You kind of just alluded to it. What are the top 2 or 3 major differences? And one of them is pretty obvious, but major differences to say being a backstage announcer for WWE as opposed to being a play-by-play announcer for a basketball game. Those major differences. And was it a tough transition for you, especially when you got to NXT? To an additional question I have on top of that is, when you asked questions backstage, were you told, hey, think of some questions to ask Finn Balor, or did a producer come up to you and say, ask this, this, and this?
No, especially with NXT, everything is scripted. So I think I had some wiggle room in terms of like it's the sentence structure and things like that, or where I would put my inflections. But other than that, the entire promos backstage were scripted. So usually it was like usually it's an on-cam. And what was different about NXT is we didn't do any of those, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my guest at this time.
God.
The only reason we didn't do that was because we didn't have a live audience. We would do them, in a separate set. Like we're not doing those because you're taping 4 shows and you're sometimes taping them out of order. You're just, you're kind of, because there's no crowd reaction. There's no reason to bring them in like that. So True. A lot of them start on a 2-shot, which was a lot better for me, for one, because I could go right into the question and I have to do that whole ridiculous, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome it just was so dumb and overdone. I hated it, but it allowed me to be more like, I compare it to being like, and you've been in locker rooms before, like, being a reporter at the locker room of an NBA player, and usually you get one question, right? Because there's a whole scrum of people around you. They're asking questions. So I always liken the question to that, and he's here, standing here. I've got my microphone, and I'm asking a question. So it allowed me to kind of go right into the question, and allowed me to kind of like focus on the talent and focus on the meaning of the question as if I had a knowledge base for why I'm asking that question. So for instance, like with Finn, I interviewed Finn quite a bit when I was doing backstage interviews in NXT. So it was always kind of like storyline related to guys that were chasing him for the NXT title. So I'll remember one that was like, Samoa Joe and Sami Zayn, I think, were having a match to determine the number one contender. And I was like, so Sammy, you got this number one contenders match coming up tonight, and will you be watching backstage? So you try to change the inflections like you're actually having a real conversation with that person. But so many people just kind of ask the question and just kind of leave it really flat. I think there's certain people there that are really good at the current format. I think Caleb Braxton, is really, really good. At doing the backstage stuff now within the limitations, but I think there's other folks there than the last few years that haven't been as great. But yeah, that's kind of. I would say there's nothing more different than doing a backstage interview for WWE than doing play-by-play. I would say play-by-play in WWE and TV is very similar in that the show is pretty constructed, and as you know, like when we're doing TV. And a lot of folks who may be listening aren't familiar with this, but this is going to go into a little broadcast speak, so bear with me. But your producers will always go over what they call elements with you. Like, you'll sit down at the table usually 45 minutes, an hour before the game, and they'll say, hey, these are all the graphics that we could potentially use during the game. Here are some of the video elements or video packages that we were going to use at different times. This one we'll use in the first quarter. This one we might use in the fourth. Here are some of the other things that we might use. This is a standings graphic of this other league that, we're going to have a game on next week or coming up after this game. Here's a slate of the matchup of the game that we're going to have next week. So those are things that are very similar to WWE in that eventually you're going to go to the truck or sit at the table and go over some of the elements that are part of the show. The difference is, even though Raw is scripted and SmackDown is scripted and NXT is scripted, like those scripts can change like up until and even after the show has already gone on the air.
Right.
So there are times where you're getting your next cue of what's next, literally in your ear. And that's what I would think is similar to sports, and that because sports is live and can change, and it can be a close game where you don't use any of those elements, or a bad game where you have to use all of them just to kind of fill time and have things to talk about. The ever-changing flow is something that can be similar to Raw and SmackDown, or to Raw and sports, just because Raw is so used to changing on the fly because Vince makes changes quite a bit. So even though it's scripted, it acts as a live show a lot of times for the announcers because they don't know what's coming up next a lot of the time.
Did you ever get the chance to meet the almighty Vince McMahon?
I did not. I walked past Vince once when we were at the Royal Rumble in Orlando. But that was the only time. I met Stephanie a couple of times because she would come down to NXT every now and then. I think she would come to every takeover. So I would see her there, and I would see Hunter all the time. But yeah, never got to meet Vince. Kevin Dunn I did get to meet during my interview, but never Vince.
When you met Stephanie, did you make it known that you were also a BU Terrier?
You know what? I don't remember. I don't remember that coming up. I'm wondering if that was a bad play by me. I would have maybe stuck around a little bit longer if I had Stephanie in my corner. But no, I don't think it came up that I was a fellow BU Terrier.
I think one of the big things people are maybe listening for here in this interview is it's Michael Cole. I mean, he is one of those polarizing figures. It's funny. He's the John Cena or the Roman Reigns of the announcers. I mean, if you look at it, I mean, the guy has been around for 23 years in the company. He if I remember correctly, was a war correspondent for CNN even before getting into wrestling, which is that's quite the difference in job titles. I don't know if it was CNN, may have been CBS.
No, it was CBS Radio. He actually worked at KTRH, which was a CBS Radio affiliate in Houston.
Yeah, he's a Texas guy, right? Yeah.
Yeah, he even though he grew up in New York, he's been in Texas quite a long time, and now actually he lives in the same area that I do down here in Deep South Texas.
So I guess what I'm getting at here is your dealings with Michael Cole. Again, he gets, it's one end of the spectrum where I feel like it's people like you and me who are in the sports broadcasting business. We 100% respect what he does and what he's probably gotten through over the last 20 plus years. But you got to work obviously closely with him. How was his management style in terms of trying to make you into kind of the mold of what a WWE announcer is supposed to be, I guess, if that makes sense?
Well, I'll be honest with you, man. I didn't spend a lot of time working with Cole. I had expected to. So the way the announcing thing was set up prior to me getting there was that it was kind of a shift in how they were doing the announcing. When Tom first, I don't know how far back you want me to go, but I'm going to go back a little bit here because the NXT kind of process for announcers has kind of really evolved in a lot of different ways over the last 7 or 8 years. But the original plan was that, TV production would hire the announcers and they would send them down to NXT, and that's how they would get their work in. So like when Tom was hired along the same times. I can't remember the other gentleman's name that was part of the broadcast team, but there were 2 NXT announcers. There was Tom, and then there was this other guy.
I think I think you're referring to, and I can't remember his name either, but I think he had some connection to St. John's potentially. It was maybe a sports play-by-play guy with St. John's. The name is escaping me, but I remember someone being there for like a couple of months and then being gone.
Yeah, and I'll look it up as we're talking about it, but I just remember. Let's see. Here it is. It's Tony. His name was Tony Luffman, and then he became Tony Dawson when he was with the company. But so the way it kind of worked then is that they, Jim Ross, who was still with the company at the time, would work with the announcers. So this was like back in 2012, 2013, and Jim Ross would produce the NXT announcers.
Oh wow! Okay, yeah.
So Jim Ross would work with guys like Byron Saxton. He would work with guys, and if you remember some of the very early episodes of when NXT started being filmed at Full Sail, Jim Ross was on the call in a lot of those matches, and then it evolved into where they had
called the Seth Rollins title, the title win.
Exactly, and William Regal was involved in that as well. And the idea was that they wanted to kind of integrate Jim Ross and as a producer into developing the new crop of announcers. Well, during the process of Tom and Tony being there, one guy, and Tom will tell you that Tom was actually a Jim Ross guy, and Tony was actually a Michael Cole guy. Believe it or not, I still don't understand how that it was possible. But anyways, at some point, Dawson, I think, got released or he left company. So they were looking for another number 2 chair. And that's how Rich Brennan kind of came into the fold. My buddy Rich, who took over for me at Booker T's school doing the announcing. Then he got signed as a result of him being with Booker T. And then he was there for about 1.5 years or 2 years. And then I going back to the story how I got signed, whatever. So when Rich was there, Cole had taken over in the announcers in terms of training them, in terms of hiring them, etc. And a lot of what was being done at the TV production office up in Stamford was now being put on Cole's plate. So when Cole brought Rich in, it was so he could train to be the next voice of NXT, but it was also so that he could be a part of the Performance Center. He was going to be in charge of scheduling the ring announcers, because at the time when they scheduled ring announcers, all the ring announcers at NXT were talent that wasn't being used. We're not wrestling yet. So like Summer Rae at one point was a ring announcer. Alexa was a ring announcer. I think Charlotte ring announced a couple of times before she started getting used.
Imagine being at that show. You could say that you were at the show that Charlotte Flair was a ring announcer for.
Right. That's how Dasha kind of got thrown into the fold. And then at some point when Rich was there, Rich started coming up to do main event. So he would fly to Raw on Sundays. He'd do Raw because that's where they would take main event at the time. And then he would leave on Tuesdays and come back to NXT and then be at the Performance Center for the rest of the week. Well, then at some point he started needing to be on the road for both shows, which was Monday, Tuesday. Well, at that point, the live event people wanted to bring in hosts instead of ring announcers. They wanted to have WWE live events have a host and a ring announcer, which is something I don't even think they do now anymore, especially now that Johnny Greco's not working for the company anymore. Johnny Greco was like the head live event producer. But this was around the time where Justin had got let go, so they needed a new ring announcer. Brandy had got called back up to the main roster. Brandy Rhodes.
Who? You mean Eden Styles?
Eden Styles got called back up to the main roster because remember she left and came back to the company.
Yeah.
So I'm going through this whole history lesson. I'm trying to do it off the top of my head. But that's when Greg Hamilton came in. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that there was someone always at the Performance Center that was an announcer that would schedule the announcers for the Florida live events, but also help with promo classes and pretty much anything that needed to be done from a production side of things or anything that needed to be done from a talent relations side of things. There was someone there that was with the company that could kind of almost work as a liaison or just be an extra set of hands, right? So Rich started to slide out of that picture. Greg was brought in, and then Greg started to be called up onto the main roster doing live events, WWE Live. And that's when Dasha started coming in. And then that's when I got hired. So during that time, Cole would come down to NXT like every other week and work with Rich when Rich was doing commentary as he was developing his style, because the only thing Rich would do is do commentary on those 4 shows once a month, and that was it, But there was a design time frame where Cole would come down and then work with the announcers. So they would bring in guys like Tensai would come in and do commentary, who's now obviously Matt Bloom is now the head coach, but Matt Bloom was doing commentary. Alex Riley would come in, Renee Young would come in, Byron Saxon would come in, and they would do mock commentary inside the audio booth there at the Performance Center. And Cole would be there, and he would either do it being there, producing you, or he would produce you remotely via Skype and kind of give you some pointers and say, do this, don't do this, try this next time, whatever. But it was a kind of way for Cole to kind of have a school of sorts for his up and coming announcers. And if you remember at this point, Tom was on the main roster doing SmackDown, and Rich was pretty much the only NXT play-by-play guy. Well, at some point, Tom gets demoted, and Rich goes up and does SmackDown. So during that time is the time I got signed. So when Tom came back down, he started doing NXT full time again in January of 2014. This was after Takeover Respect. I think Takeover Respect was Rich's last Takeover special. I'm sorry. Takeover London was his last Takeover special. So Tom comes in, and then Tom, as I was being signed, it was told to me that Tom was going to be my equal. He was going to do live events, Florida live events with me. He was going to be doing commentary for NXT. But I was also told during this process that I was eventually, within a couple of months, be the number 2 NXT play-by-play guy, where we would alternate people the way it used to be back in 2012 and 2013. Well, that just never that just never came about. That never happened. And it never happened because they put Tom in charge of me. Well, Tom, and I'll say this a million times, Tom, I think, is a great announcer, but I think he's a terrible human being. I think he wanted to make sure that he kept anybody that was threatening his position down. And I never got the opportunity, except maybe one or two times, to work in the booth with him. Every time I tried to work in the mirror room was kind of the promo room where talent could like work on their promos. Rich was given carte blanche to go up there and work with talent and do interviews. Well, Tom, anytime I tried to help a talent out by being kind of just the stick for them to do interviews, I would get in trouble for that. I would get in trouble, and I would get he would send an email to Cole saying, "Hey, Alex is doing this," when that wasn't part of the deal. Like, the whole idea of the Performance Center is to grab the brass ring and work and work and work and try to improve. And I wanted to do that, so I would work with Billie Kay all the time. Billie Kay loved to put in the extra work, so I would work with her on her interviews because she wasn't on TV at the time, at least not with a character. This was before the whole Iconics thing started to kind of take off. And I would work with her, and then I would get in trouble for working with the talent in the mirror room. So anything that I would do to try to get better on my own, it was always seen as you're doing too much. You're doing too much. So because Tom was in charge of me, and this goes back to your original question, was what was Cole like as a boss? Well, I always got Cole through the chain of screaming, for those who are How I Met Your Mother fans. So I always got Tom Phillips or Greg Hamilton complaining about me in some way, shape, or form. So I always got the reverberal feedback through Cole saying, "Hey, what are you doing? Why are you doing this?" etc. And so I never got to work with Cole on a day-to-day basis, like guys like Rich or Tom did. And I regret that, because I think at times where I've seen Cole work and seen Cole produce, like during those early days before I was signed and I would go down to NXT for tapings, I would sit right next to Cole and I'd have a headset on so I could watch Cole produce the announcers. And I learned so much from watching Cole, produce Rich and Graves and Paxton. And I would have loved to have gotten that type of training, because there's nothing I would have loved more than to work with the guy that's actually in charge, as opposed to the guy that thinks he's in charge. And unfortunately for me, I was kind of in a situation. And look, there are probably things I could have done better or done differently. I fully acknowledge that. And I wish I would have been more strategic. I wish I would have been a little less hot-headed on a couple of things. And I wish I would have trusted certain people more and certain people less when I was there. But I think most importantly, I just wish I would have had the same opportunity that Rich had, because if I had that same opportunity, I think both he and I would still be there. But I think we kind of surrendered power because we were in a situation where, we just didn't want to rock the apple cart, or we didn't want to, we didn't want to cause a stir. So we didn't try to assert ourselves to kind of take over the announcing at the NXT level. And other people did, and that's kind of why things are the way they are.
Well, that's, that is some inside stuff. I know you have told me bits and pieces of this over the last couple of years, but hearing it all together like that really does kind of map it out. You brought up, obviously, Jim Ross. I believe you've been able to keep a relationship with Jim Ross, and I know AEW has been in Texas a bunch already. You've had a chance to kind of see what they're doing, and what are your thoughts on how they are working as a company right now?
So I think everything that AEW is doing is great. And I'm not saying that because I have friends there. I'm not saying that because I'm just a fan of the show. I'm just saying that because being back there and talking with some of the talent and just like, I'll be honest, man, like when you go backstage to Raw or SmackDown, and this isn't a knock on the company at all. It's just kind of a fact in a situation of how corporate WWE is now as a backstage environment. It's just very like pins and needles, walking on eggshells. You see a lot of folks either kind of hiding out, or you see these little cliques form. You see a lot of conversations that are done like whispering. Everything is like you're looking behind your back. And the creative process seems to be stalled in that it's a lot of sitting and waiting for the scripts to come out, and then for producers and writers assistants to go look for the talent so we can work on pre-tapes, we can work on the script of the show, we can work on promos, etc. And everything is just kind of like sitting and waiting. So the talent aren't as involved in the creative process as probably they should be. It's completely opposite at AEW, and everything is so welcoming. Everything is so light and energetic. You see a lot more people watching at the monitor than I would. I remember at Raw and SmackDown. At NXT, everyone was watching the monitor because if you weren't being used, you were watching on the screen in the classroom. In that big, massive classroom that they always show on WWE 24s or backstage shows. But AEW is just, I just love their creative process. I love that they're willing to make mistakes. I love that they're willing to try new things. I love that they're edgy without being kind of salacious, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, they have that quote unquote attitude, but they're not, 1999. They're not going the Vince Russo way.
They act like they're a TNT drama. And, you watch anything on TNT, you're going to hear certain expletives that are now allowed on cable television at that hour. You're going to see a little bit of blood. You're going to see a little bit of a little bit more violence. And I just like the fact that they are willing to go a certain direction with their product without it being kind of too over the top and trying to be different, almost being like an alternative. Kind of like how NXT was for that stretch between like 2013 and 2015. Like, I think that's the real heyday of NXT.
Before they started to go out and travel with the takeovers and like become part of WrestleMania weekend and all that.
Yeah, when it was really like the punk rock of WWE, and now it's just kind of like, now it's like NXT back in 2013 to 2015. That was kind of like Green Day before Green Day's Basket Case song became a single, and NXT now is Green Day after that point, if that makes any sense.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. It's like now they're a little bit too mainstream. They're a little bit too corporate. They're still NXT. They're still different, but it just feels like it's not quite the same as that heyday.
Do you think that happens with the move to USA, or it was already happening? It had already been happening.
No, it was already happening, and I don't want this. This isn't a knock on Ronaldo at all, but it happened when they made Ronaldo the lead announcer for NXT, because it ceased being. At that moment is when I believe it ceased being a developmental program.
So that's more of you're speaking highly of Morrow because you're saying he's a major league type of voice, right?
He is a major league type of voice. There's no question about it. Do I have issues with some of his pop culture references sometimes that I don't think anybody understands? Yes, but that doesn't take away from the fact that he is a excellent pro wrestling announcer, and he's someone that people identify with as a big name. That's why they signed him in the first place, because they were moving to SmackDown. They were moving SmackDown to being live, and they needed a voice for SmackDown that could be that voice of SmackDown. Because he was moving to USA, it was going to be live, and they needed a big name to fill that void. And that's why Rich got demoted. And I believe Morrow's hiring is the reason that both Rich and myself are not there, because the Marks now had their announcer. They didn't need another wrestling announcer. They got it. But at the same time, I also feel that once Morrow took over NXT, when he left, and then he left for a while, took a hiatus, and then signed that short-term deal, and then became a full-time NXT guy. I feel like that's when the page fully turned. I felt like they were going that direction because the takeovers were on the road now with with all the major
Brooklyn
pay-per-views
and Toronto and doing WrestleMania weekend. Yeah.
Yeah. So like you weren't doing those full sale takeovers anymore. So the intimacy of the takeover specials were different. They weren't changing the sets like they were before. Because if you remember the early takeovers, like every set was very different, very, very different every time they did a takeover special. And it was almost like after they went to the White Ropes of Brooklyn, that was like the beginning of the change because that was the first big arena show. And then after that, it kind of slowly evolved into this is NXT, and it still looks like NXT, and we're still using guys that got popular on NXT. But there never became like that graduation moment. Like, I don't care what anybody says. When guys graduated to Raw and SmackDown, when Paige showed up and took the Divas title off of AJ Lee, that was a big moment for the NXT brand. When Charlotte Becky and Sasha showed up on Raw that one day, that was a big moment. When Sami Zayn showed up, when Bret Hart introduced Sami Zayn in Montreal for him to come out for his Raw debut, that was a big moment. I don't think those moments are as big anymore when an NXT person shows up on Raw because now they're equal. And because they're equal, there's no differentiation. Now everyone's the same. So I feel like, yes, it was a developmental system. And yes, people don't want to look at NXT as that way because they see it as a negative, but there's nothing wrong for being in NXT and being able to now say, okay, I was the NXT champion. I am now ready for the prime time. I am ready for the A show. I don't think there was anything wrong with having Raw be the A show, SmackDown be the B show, and NXT being developmental. But now that everyone's kind of on this equal playing field, and now that SmackDown's actually on broadcast TV and is technically really the A show, there's so much confusion about like, okay, what's more important? Where should our focus be? It's become this blanket focus on everything. And it's resulted in everything kind of being homogenous. And it's not – when everything is the same, nothing is special. And I don't feel NXT – I'm still saying it's special. It's not as special as it was between 2013 and 2015.
I mean, yeah, no, I agree 100% because, back then you had to seek it out. You had to be, really invested to go on the network and watch the 1 hour episodes, plan to watch a takeover. It does feel, it is, I mean, it's certain. I mean, I watched last night, we're taping this on a Thursday. I watched their episode last night, and obviously it's hard to compare what's going on now as well to kind of overall, but it's still so much different than Raw and SmackDown. But right, it lost a little bit of that underground type of edge that I think you point out that 2013, 14, 15, and maybe into 16 a little bit that it had. You've been very generous with your time here today. I got a few more things I want to hit on.
Okay.
You've had a lot of interesting, things to say here today, and I appreciate that. You obviously were, around NXT when they'd be taping maybe 2, 3, 4 shows in a day, or maybe over the span of a couple of days. With that kind of knowledge of the Performance Center and Full Sail, what WWE had to do a couple of weeks ago when they taped, I think it was 2 Raws, 2 SmackDowns, a couple of NXTs, and their 2 days of WrestleMania in the span of 2 to 3 days. Can you speak to how crazy that is, and then especially if they're dealing with not having a full crew as they normally would?
It's hard for me to fathom how that whole thing kind of went down. Like, I haven't really followed, there have been some rumors that they were taping till 5 a.m. one day and all types of stuff. I still believe they had a full production crew. I don't believe they had their talent all there on site. I think they had them, my guess is they would have them come in at different stages, of the day whenever they were needed. So they could have as few people there as possible. what boggles my mind is the creative process that they must have had to undergo over this stretch of time, because they had to prepare as if kind of what has happened is that they can now no longer tape there because of the laws there in Florida.
Or so we think.
or so we think. Go to my Twitter timeline to see what I think about Ron DeSantis. But that being said, to me, it's just so much work to put together one episode of Raw or SmackDown or NXT. For them to have a skeleton crew on the writing side and the that is the part that's kind of mind-boggling to me, because it's just such a big production. There's whether from the makeup and hair people to all the writers and writers' assistants to the producers to the agents. Like, it's just a lot of people that are involved in the process of doing the shows. And for them to have done all of that in that really short period of time, I can't imagine. But I think everyone, say what you will. I know there's a lot of people that are saying they shouldn't have done any of it. They should have canceled. I was one of the people that thought they should have canceled WrestleMania, or at least postponed it until we're out of this, until we could have had some sort of a crowd or in some sort of venue. It didn't have to be at a stadium, but maybe at a, Madison Square Garden or Allstate Arena or something like that. But I was really proud of what they were able to do. And that comes from someone who was fired by the company. What I know is that there's a lot of people there with a lot of passion for what this business is, and that's to entertain people and to make people happy and enjoy themselves. And I was especially proud of Jeremy Borash and his crew that put together the Boneyard match, because I thought that was one of the more unique, creative things that they've done ever in that company. And I think both Taker and AJ Styles should be commended for buying into that, because it's very different than what both of them have been used to. In fact, and Taker's done a lot of off-site things in the past, but it's never been a match. It's never been a WrestleMania match. He's done his Buried Alives and all that stuff, but it's all been done at a venue. But for Taker to buy in and for AJ Styles to buy in and giving us was probably one of the more entertaining segments of a WrestleMania ever. I half joked about this, but I can honestly see the way Taker looked and performed and the way he acted in that. Like, I could see USA or Fox saying, "Hey, we should do like this a drama series where Taker's this vigilante justice warrior, where he just shows up on a motorcycle, beats people up, and sticks them in a grave. He could literally be like Ghost Rider, but you could have him be the Undertaker, and just call it the Undertaker, and have him be this vigilante Batman, Daredevil type guy, superhero."
If any TV executives are listening right now, there you go. Get $1 million idea.
I mean, wouldn't you watch that? Wouldn't you watch an 8-episode arc on Netflix or Fox or something like that?
I think
during the
it'd
summer
be
months?
a Netflix. I feel like it'd be a Netflix show.
Yeah.
No, actually, it'd be a WWE Network show.
It probably would be it, but I think the thing is it looked like a television drama the way it was shot, and I thought that was really cool, and so I'm really happy with what they were able to do, despite the circumstances that we're all in, and I wish the talent nothing but the best, and hopefully they can get back to performing in front of people very soon.
A couple of quick fire rapid questions I got for you here. Hopefully they'll be easy for you. In NXT, who was the best wrestler you worked with when in terms of interviewing? Who was someone that you just it was easier than anything you'd ever done?
I would have to say I think we only did 2 interviews together, but I have to say Dash and Dawson. It was always fun working with them. The Revival.
And then on the flip side, was there anybody that was tough to do an interview with?
Not so much on TV, but for live events, sometimes we'd have some of the talent, the younger talent that didn't have as much experience. So I'd have to walk them through a lot of things. And on Andrade at the time, his English was not great. We would have a tutor come into the performance center and work with me and Andrade and some of the other talent. She was teaching me Spanish while teaching him English. Mm-hmm. So they would put us together a lot in that I knew enough Spanish so I could help him, but I didn't know enough to where like I could do the interview in Spanish. So we would work together on trying to either me get better at my Spanish and him get better at his English. But it was a real, I wouldn't say it wasn't difficult in that I didn't like working with him. I loved working with Andrade. But it was one of the more challenging things I had to do was work with him because of the language barrier and because he wasn't, this is a guy that's used to wearing a mask and not having to do promos when he was in Mexico. So him just learning that creative process and learning how to, emote with his face was something that, was really challenging to kind of get out of.
Now, this question isn't necessarily confined to your time with NXT, but who has been the biggest positive influence when it's come to you working in and around the wrestling industry?
Positive. I'd have to say, so I had a great relationship with the coaches there. Adam Pearce was probably a guy that I love to this day. I think he's a guy that I really trusted when I was there. He tried to take care of me and walk me through the ropes of, the carniness of the wrestling business. And we had known each other for a long time when he was, still the NWA champion, doing small shows. That's how I met him, is I would ring announce for shows that he would come down to South Texas for as the NWA champion. We had a lot of similar friends in the business. So Adam Pearce is one of those. Terry Taylor, I learned so much from Terry Taylor when I was there. I would ride to towns with him as well. And then Robbie Brookside, just my absolute best friend when I was at the Performance Center. He took care of me. He took care of me the day I got fired. He, took me out for dinner and we stayed up drinking all night at his apartment because he wanted me to feel good about myself, because he said it had nothing to do with my abilities and everything to do with somebody making a decision up above that didn't really know how hard I worked or how good I was. So he always made me feel at ease. So those are three. And then I guess from an announcing perspective, it'd have to be Rich or Jim Ross. Rich, just because he's my best friend and has been for, going on 15 years at this point. And Jim Ross for being so unbelievably kind to me after I got released. And he gave me my first wrestling play-by-play opportunity after I got released, doing this wrestling show in Oklahoma called Oklahomania. And then for allowing me to kind of sit under his learning tree for 5 or 10 minutes at a time when AEW has been in town in Texas to let me hang out and be around him and just chat with him and just be around the business.
That's awesome stuff. One final thing. Do you ever see a time where, whether it's AEW or another company, that can ever leapfrog the WWE, or is it the fact that that company is just so big now, it's like Coca-Cola, it's like Kleenex is to tissues, chapstick is to lip balm, that it's just too established that it'll never not be number one?
I think...
barring unforeseen circumstances, obviously.
So but see, I don't look at them as the same type of company. Like one is a wrestling, one is a wrestling television show, and one is a sports entertainment company. So I don't look at them in the same way. Yes, AEW has merchandise and AEW, has pay-per-view events, but in the end, they're still just a one show a week company. They're much more the same as like a show that gets picked up by, like if you're a production house and you have a sitcom that gets picked up by a network. Mm-hmm. But the network doesn't own the show, but they put the show on, and the production company, hires the actors and hires the the writers and all that stuff, and and they put together this program that shows up on that network. That's more what AEW is. WWE not only produces their own shows, but they're also a live event company. They're also a they also have a streaming service. So they're built in a much more different way because they're a live event company. Mm-hmm. I can see AEW kind of venture off into live events, but they also are a very different animal. Like, they don't have as many full-time talent. WWE probably has on their payroll somewhere almost around 200 to 225 full-time wrestling talent. It's probably actually closer to 250 now that I think about it, with NXT UK and whoever they have signed in Asia. But if you think about NXT UK and you think about NXT, and you think NXT has over 115 people down there, you think about everyone who's on Raw and SmackDown, there's probably 60 people at least on each roster. I mean, that's a lot of people. AEW has a fraction of that as full-time talent, and a lot of other people that they bring in on a case-by-case basis. I don't think you can look at AEW and WWE the same way. You would have to. I mean, it would take a company like Apple or Disney, like starting a wrestling company that would be competitive from a business perspective to overtake WWE. Can I think AEW be more popular than WWE one day? Actually, yeah, I do. I think they could win a ratings battle with WWE down the road when they've established themselves even further. But I also think WWE puts on so much more programming, and because they had I know Impact was around, but I don't think it had anywhere. It never had the buzz, and I don't really know why that AEW has been able to get, from a pop culture perspective, which is weird because they had guys like Hogan and, Booker T and Kevin Nash and all this stuff come through Impact. But if you're looking at it from a business and a company perspective, I don't think anyone can ever be WWE, because they are Coke. They are McDonald's. They are, one of the behemoths. They are General Electric, But I think from a television programming perspective, I do think AEW could be more popular than Raw or more popular than SmackDown from a television viewer's perspective down the road. They're honestly not that far off. I mean, AEW is now consistently beating NXT because, again, there's nothing special anymore about NXT. I mean, how much longer are they going to do Gargano versus Ciampa? Like, how many more times are they going to do that feud at this point, where everything on AEW is fresh and new? So there's a certain newness and certain like mystery to what they are, mm-hmm. whereas I don't think you have that with WWE, because they have so much programming and they still recycle the same 25 people as their headliners each and every week.
All right, well, Alex, thank you for taking the time here to be the first. So you're just the guest, not just another guest. Yeah. The next guy is just another guest here on Just Another Wrestling Podcast. And for those listening, make sure you follow Alex on Twitter at Alex Del Barrio. And hopefully sooner or later the two of us will be back to our full-time jobs. But for now, it's a little more wrestling talk, I suppose. Yeah.
I'm excited for our futures, and I just hope it's sooner rather than later, because it sucks being on the sideline right now.
All right, Alex, thank you so much for the time, and we'll do this again sometime in the future.
All right, Scott, thanks a lot.
So once again, a thank you to Alex Del Barrio for joining us here on Just Another Wrestling Podcast. Be sure to tune back in when we drop another episode in just a couple of days. Until then, I'm Scott Sudikoff saying so long, and enjoy your week watching some more wrestling with all the free time you have.